don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
Personally, I've always really liked the idea of Pistoliers in the Empire army. Despite the fantastical setting of Warhammer Fantasy, firearms have always been something of an equalizer. They're not the end and be-all of Warhammer Fantasy because the setting is full of all sorts of terrible monsters that could eat lead balls for breakfast. Personally, my own forays into using Pistoliers have never quite ended well. A pistol hits with strength 4 and has armor piercing, so if you manage to hit, it will have a decent chance against a lot of nasty opponents. The operative word being if. Pistoliers have a ballistic skill of 3, meaning they will often only hit on 5s and 6s, and if you move around with them as you're supposed to, they have to get really close to the enemy to actually hit. In reality, they're also quite fragile, with a 5+ save and a toughness of 3. So using Pistoliers is always a gamble. You're not very likely to do a lot of damage to the enemy with your shots, and if you get charged or shot at, you'll likely lose a good few Pistoliers anyway. Really, in practice, I've had some successes using Pistoliers to march block enemy units and disrupt someone's marching order, by always keeping the Pistoliers just out of reach on the flanks. The thing that has always bothered me, though, about Pistoliers is their armor. They're consistently depicted as wearing a lot of armor. I just refuse to accept that a man wearing armor that is almost on his entire body is deserving of a 6+ save. Even if the metal armor is made by mere humans, it just defies any logic that a goblin with a pot on their head and someone almost fully encased in steel are the same level of protected. Like a lot in the Empire army, Pistoliers are inspired by real-world pistol-armed cavalry units. Units like the German Reiters wore metal armor and carried several pistols and a sword. They were expected to engage the enemy with their pistols and their swords, although it was commanders like Gustavus Adolphus who pioneered and developed the shock cavalry doctrines that they would later evolve into. I feel like Pistoliers struggle for their niche because they're incredibly fragile and lack the firepower to make them a genuine missile cavalry threat. Yes, each Pistolier can fire twice, but firing at long range, which is 12 inches, and firing twice means they only hit on a 6+. Getting them close is a surefire way of getting them killed, especially if the opponent knows what pistols can do. Granted, you could expose an enemy flank if they wheel to deal with the Pistoliers, or save another unit if the enemy wastes a shooting attack on seeing the Pistoliers off. But the idea of them being entirely disposable cavalry when they're sons of nobles doesn't necessarily sit right with me either. So I want to propose a modification to the Pistoliers to make them more dedicated pistol cavalry, while preserving some of their elan as well. My idea is basically to model Pistoliers after the real historical cuirassier cavalry unit. Cuirassiers were, at least in the 17th century, pistol-armed cavalry that also wore heavy armor. As a result, these cavalry troopers were often able to close with the enemy and fire their pistols even under the threat of counterfire, in some cases being almost point blank. Like Pistoliers, they also made use of unprotected horses, but unlike Pistoliers, they were described as wearing quite heavy armor, especially for the time period. So I think if we gave the Pistoliers a cuirassier-type armor, that would improve their utility quite a lot. So I'm thinking something along the lines of heavy armor that gives an additional +1 to the armor save against ranged attacks, or maybe just light armor that gives that additional +1 to the armor save against ranged attacks. While cuirassier armor is described as being quite protective, and was often described as being bulletproof, at least against pistols, it wasn't the most effective thing for fighting in melees. So, Pistoliers are usually the second sons of nobles. Their parents must provide for their equipment, and it makes sense that a father might not want his son to die to a stiff breeze with his 6+ armor save. Giving the Pistoliers better armor encourages you to play aggressive with them to soak enemy fire as they get close to use their pistols. Their armor is not so good as to rely on them to charge home with sword in hand. That utility is still better served by knights, 100% with their +1 armor save. The other alternative would be to remove the armor entirely and make Pistoliers even lighter cavalry, more akin to something like a Napoleonic dragoon. That would reduce their cost and make me more likely to view them as expendable, but I think you would get more use out of them if you didn't even have to think about them as being protected. I think this would differentiate them from Outriders, which I have always tended to prefer when I played, as Outriders can do a lot more damage than Pistoliers, even if they cost a lot more points. I personally like the idea that a veteran moves from being a Pistolier to an Outrider, and they shed their heavy armor of their youth because they know that they're not going to expose themselves to as much danger. They're much more wise to the ways of the world and to the battlefield, and so they know they can shed the heavy armor, which is cumbersome and bulky, and trade it up for something much lighter because they're not going to ride into danger as much because they're not, young Pistoliers. They also have longer ranged weapons, which incentivizes them to stay away from the enemy, and they are better horsemen. Furthermore, their guns are move or fire only, which means they can't zip around firing willy-nilly. They have to rely on speed to escape danger and stay away from anything that can actually harm them. Armor for them is an impediment to their job, whereas for the Pistoliers, they really want to be as close to the enemy as possible to minimize the shooting penalties for long range or using multiple shots. So, let me know what you think of this idea. I think it would have been nice to have the models of Pistoliers match their actual rules, but I also know that it's an incredibly niche thing to grumble over.